This lecture is on the medical-pharmaceutical insurance complex that rules health in the United States, mental health particularly, and physical health, and there's a combine there between these three. Now I'm going to begin this by talking about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. It was written in 1962, made into a movie, and it won the 5 basic awards in the Academy Awards. The narrator is the big chief, a big Indian, who is in a mental hospital, and there he begins and he has these mental ramblings, hallucinations, and he says he's inside a huge machine, he's helpless, he can't go against the huge combine that is just chewing up people, and he feels overwhelmed in his mind and thinks there's a fog descending where he is. So he's there, and then all of a sudden, coming into the hospital is a man by the name of, excuse me, Randall Patrick McMurphy. He's a playful guy. He got into the mental hospital because he didn't like working at a camp where he was being penalized by the state government. And he thought it would be easier living in a mental hospital, so he started acting cuckoo. This Randall Patrick McMurphy begins to fight against the machine, and the narrator of the book, the big chief, the large Indian, very muscular, powerful, 6'7" or so, and he begins to look at McMurphy. Now, the chief has been saying that he's deaf and mute. He can't talk and can't hear. And they allow him to sweep and mop the floors. Well, he can hear and he can speak, and McMurphy is not fooled by it and begins talking to him. They have in the hospital, it's the ward that they're on is run by Miss Ratched, whom McMurphy calls Miss Ratched. And he begins to sabotage her and helps different people on the ward. He goes to a group therapy meeting and basically says, this is a castration society where you're trying to ruin these people by not talking about the truth. And I can tell you, I totally agree as I analyze that book and see what Miss Ratched did in the meetings. Well, the book goes on, and they begin to treat McMurphy with drugs, which he'll put in his mouth and put under his tongue, and then when they go away, spits out. And then they give him electric shock treatment because he's not going along with the rule of Miss Ratched. And then they lobotomize him. They go in through the eyes, and this was done in mental hospitals in America. They could do it. They would anesthetize, and they would go in with a knife, scrape along the front of the lobes on the front side of the brain, and that would basically make people into a vegetable or very compliant person. I remember opposing it, but I didn't have any power, and finally they did get rid of the lobotomies. Now I need to go that my complaint against the complex of medical, pharmaceutical, and insurance is not against either one of them. Insurance is a good option if it's not too expensive. Pharmaceuticals are occasionally necessary, and of course medicine, I would never oppose that. But when the three of them get united in terms of mental health, then I see a great problem, and I saw it over my 50-year career doing therapy, but also another 10 years in my graduate schools that I attended. So I've watched this complex rule hospitals and clinics and individual practices because money is available. I saw psychoanalysts leave their practice and go into doing this form because they could make quadruple amount of money. Well, now I'm going to switch to another book. There's no doubt in my mind, and many other people who've studied modern novels, that David Foster Wallace is the greatest novel of the late 20th, early 21st century. David Foster Wallace wrote a book called Infinite Jest, which is over 1,000 pages. And the title of Infinite Jest comes from when Hamlet finds a skull and raises it. Oh, he says, poor Yorick, I knew him well, a man of infinite jest. The skull that David Foster Wallace is examining happens to be modern society. And he says it's incredibly boring, that technology has made everything so ultimately easy that it's boring. Television is boring. Regular life is boring. Going to a grocery store is boring. Everything is boring. David Foster Wallace, I might say, grew up in a home where his mother was a teacher of writing. And at meals, she would do something like say, we're going to discuss adjectives right now, and I'll give you a noun, and you come up with different adjectives. And so the other members of the family would come up with adjectives. She'd say encyclopedia, and they'd say great, super, wonderful, terrific. And David Foster Wallace would come up with very funny adjectives. But his mother was always after him to write. And she was in his head. When he was on later on talk shows, because he was an excellent writer, he would say that when he was not writing, he was wondering why he shouldn't be writing. He got involved in this complex of medical-pharmaceutical insurance, and they put him on, what was the, let me see if I can find it, Nardo. He was on a Nardo that would stop him from anxiety episodes. He was on it for over 10 years. In the course of his treatment by this complex, these three major industries, they gave him shock treatment a number of times. They tried different medicines, but nothing worked. Now, I would not have treated him with medicine, nor would my wife. We approached people, and one of the things I would say to David Foster Wallace is, you've got to divorce your mother. She's in your head, and you are obsessive, and she's driving. And so I would do various maneuvers to get him to understand what his mother had done to him and he had done to himself as he put her as the driving obsession in his head. He could have still maintained the wonderful use of language. I would have also worked with him in many different ways to face up to solitude, and to not go off on rants against loneliness. Some of his book, Infinite Jest, is narcissistic, and I would have confronted that, and I guarantee you my wife would have confronted it every day. That you're not so damn important, you're going to die like all the rest of us, and your book will sit on a shelf and be lost eventually, so get over it. Do your best and let it go. So we would have approached David Foster Wallace differently. I looked at all of his confessed conflicts. I looked at the way he was interviewed. I like him. I like his spontaneity. I like his analysis of the boring culture that we have that does not confront ideologies like I'm doing in this series. And I'm very sad to report that David Foster Wallace, at a very young age, I think about 44, hung himself. He had tried suicide several times. And what the complex did was try different medicines and shock treatment. My wife and I, in our 40 years of working together, and each of us an additional 10 years when we were in private practice, never had a suicide. We never had anybody checked into a mental hospital. It was very rare that we referred somebody for medicines, but then we would work with them while that solved their chemical fluctuations. So, one thing about this book is that the big Indian, after they lobotomized Randall Patrick McMurphy, he broke out of the mental hospital and went to freedom. He was done with Miss Ratched. He was done with the ideology, and he ran free. Toxic ideologies always are based on the human tendency to dependency. My wife and I work for freedom for people. We did not make them dependent on drugs or dependent on insurance or dependent on the community of psychologists and psychiatrists that were pushing dependency. So I end this message, this lecture, with 3 words. Freedom is better.